Between 1883 and 1928, the New York police arrested men for selling the Brooklyn Bridge on more than one occasion. And every time, the buyer had paid in good faith, believed he owned it, and had the paperwork to prove it. One man is credited with doing it roughly twice a week for 30 years. He also sold Grant's tomb, the Statue of Liberty, Madison Square Garden, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He was convicted 3 times and died in Sing Sing, having spent his last years in a prison, where the staff reportedly asked him to tell the stories again. But the part worth understanding is not that people fell for it. It is why the trick worked at all, because in 19th century America, buying a bridge and charging tolls on it was a completely normal business, and the buyers were not being stupid. They were being sold a plausible transaction in an economy where that transaction genuinely existed. The fraud only looks absurd from the other side of a change in how America owned things. Start with the bridge, because the bridge is the reason. When the Brooklyn Bridge opened in May 1883, it was the longest suspension bridge in the world and the most conspicuous object in the United States. Its towers were the tallest structures on the continent. It had taken 14 years, cost around $15 million, and killed somewhere over 20 men, including the engineer who designed it. It also charged a toll, a penny to walk across, 5 cents for a horse and rider, more for wagons. The tolls were not a token. They had been designed to pay off the enormous construction debt, and they were collected with the seriousness of a business that needed the money. There were separate rates for pedestrians, for horses, for cattle being driven across, for 1-horse wagons and 2-horse wagons, and for the cable cars that ran along the center of the span. Toll houses stood at each end with men in them taking coins, all day, every day. That is the detail modern readers skip past, and it is load-bearing for everything that follows. The bridge was a revenue-generating asset. Somebody collected money at the end of it every day from tens of thousands of people. In its first year, it carried over 11 million crossings. So a stranger telling you that the bridge could be owned, and that owning it meant collecting those pennies, was not describing a fantasy. He was describing the actual business model of the thing in front of you. It is worth knowing what the bridge had cost to build, because that is part of why it commanded the awe it did. John Augustus Roebling designed it. He was a German-born engineer who had already built suspension bridges at Niagara and Cincinnati, and he had spent years arguing that a span across the East River was possible at all. In 1869, surveying the Brooklyn Tower site, his foot was crushed between a ferry and the pilings. He developed tetanus and died within weeks before construction properly began. His son, Washington Roebling, took over. To sink the foundations, the work used caissons, enormous timber boxes, open at the bottom, pressed down into the riverbed and filled with compressed air to keep the water out. Men worked inside them, digging, in air pressure several times normal. Nobody understood decompression sickness. Men came up too fast and were struck down with what they called caisson disease, joint pain so severe it bent them double, which is where the name, the bends, comes from. Some were paralyzed, some died. Washington Roebling was one of them. He was left partially paralyzed and in chronic pain, and for the remaining 11 years of construction, he directed the work from a window in Brooklyn Heights, watching through a telescope. His wife, Emily Warren Roebling, learned the engineering. She studied catenary curves, cable specifications, and stress analysis, carried her husband's instructions to the site daily, dealt with the contractors and the trustees, and became, for practical purposes, the chief engineer's voice. When the bridge opened, she was the first to cross it. There was also fraud in the construction itself, which is a detail with some irony given what followed. a contractor named J. Lloyd Hague supplied wire for the cables that failed inspection and substituted rejected wire for approved. By the time it was discovered, the bad wire was already woven into the structure and could not be removed. Roebling's solution was to add hundreds of extra wires to compensate, which is why the bridge carries a safety factor far above what its designer originally specified. So the object George Parker was selling had cost 14 years, around 27 deaths, an engineer's life, his son's health, and a cable scandal, and stood over the city as the most visible proof available that Americans built enormous things and made money from them. Selling that was not selling a fantasy. It was selling a share in the most conspicuous success in the country. And private ownership of infrastructure was not exotic in that America. It was the norm. This is worth laying out properly, because it is the single fact that makes the whole story make sense, and it is the one most modern audiences do not have. For the first century of American independence, the default assumption was that infrastructure was built by private companies under a charter from a state legislature, and paid for by charging the people who used it. Turnpike companies owned roads and charged you to use them, thousands of miles of them, chartered by state legislatures, paying dividends to shareholders. Private bridge companies were ordinary. Ferries were licensed monopolies. The Roeblings' own earlier bridge at Niagara was privately financed. Much of the rail network, the canals, the water supply in many cities, the gas, and eventually the electricity were all held by private companies with charters to charge the public for access. The numbers are larger than people expect. By the 1830s, several thousand turnpike companies had been chartered across the eastern states, running tens of thousands of miles of road between them. Pennsylvania alone chartered hundreds. They sold shares, held meetings, paid, or more often failed to pay dividends, and put a gate across the road with a man collecting money at it. Bridges were the same, and often better business, because a bridge has no alternative route. A turnpike can be avoided by taking the old road. A river crossing cannot. Charters for bridge companies were fought over in state legislatures precisely because a well-placed crossing was a license to collect money from everybody who needed to get to the other side. The Supreme Court heard a case about exactly this in 1837, the Charles River Bridge dispute in Massachusetts, where the owners of an existing toll bridge argued that chartering a second, free bridge alongside it destroyed the value of their franchise. The court found against them, and the decision is taught to this day as a turning point in how American law weighed private charter rights against public benefit. That case is a century before Parker, and it tells you the question of who owns a bridge and what they may charge for it was live, contested, and worth litigating to the highest court in the country. Water supply was frequently private. Gas lighting was private. When electricity arrived, it was private. Street railways were private. The great trunk railroads were private to a degree that made their owners the most powerful men in America, which is why the period produced the word robber baron in the first place. An immigrant arriving in New York in 1900 came from countries where the same was true. The idea that a large public structure had an owner who took the tolls was not a strange idea to be talked into. It was the ordinary assumption, which is the actual mechanism of this fraud, and it is worth stating plainly before we get to the man. He was not persuading people of something implausible. He was letting them believe something they already believed, and then attaching a false document to it. Now the man. George C. Parker was born in New York around 1860 and worked the confidence trade for something like 3 decades. Much of what is repeated about him comes from newspaper accounts and later retellings, and some of the detail has been polished over the years. The twice-a-week figure is a press flourish more than a ledger. But the convictions are real, the method is documented, and the shape of it is consistent. His pitch varied with the mark. Sometimes he was the bridge's owner, selling up. Sometimes he was an agent for an estate. Sometimes he was a city official, quietly disposing of an asset. He is also said to have worked the tourist trade around the approaches, where a man admiring the structure has already demonstrated that he finds it impressive, which is most of the work done before a word is spoken. What did not vary was the paperwork. Parker produced documents, deeds, transfer papers, letters of authority, and by the accounts of those who dealt with him, they were good. He is said to have rented offices to receive clients in, so that the transaction happened somewhere that looked like a place where transactions happened. He is credited with producing forged documentation, establishing his ownership before a mark ever raised the question. That is the whole craft, and it is not really about the bridge. A confidence trick does not work by making the impossible seem possible. It works by removing, one at a time, every reason a reasonable person would have to stop. The price moved with the buyer. Accounts mentioned sales for as little as $50 and as much as $50,000. That range tells you he was reading people rather than selling a fixed thing. And the buyers were very often new arrivals, immigrants with savings, looking for a business in a city where fortunes visibly were being made by people who had bought the right asset at the right moment. Consider that position honestly before deciding they were fools. You have crossed an ocean. You have money you have saved for years. You are in a country whose entire mythology is that ordinary people acquire assets and become wealthy. You do not know which institutions are public and which are private, because the answer differs by state, by city, and by decade. A well-dressed man in an office shows you a deed to a toll bridge you can see from the window, and offers you a price you can afford. The failure is not stupidity, it is the absence of a way to check. That is the part that has changed, and it is the reason the fraud died. In 1883, there was no way for a private buyer to verify who owned a large structure without physically going to a records office, knowing which one, and knowing what to ask for. Title records existed but were fragmentary and local. There was no telephone call to make, no registry to search, no professional layer of title insurance in most transactions. Confirming the story cost more effort than most buyers could manage, and the seller knew exactly how much friction stood between the mark and the truth. It is worth walking through the sale itself as it would have been experienced, because the individual steps are all reasonable, and it is only the sum that is absurd. You are approached, or you answer an advertisement, or you are introduced by somebody who seems to know what they are talking about. The subject is a business opportunity, and it is not pitched as a bargain. A bargain invites suspicion. It is pitched as a problem the seller needs to solve. The seller has inherited an interest and lives elsewhere, or the estate is being wound up. Or there is a dispute among owners, and one party wants out quickly. All of these are ordinary reasons that real assets change hands below their worth, and all of them explain the discount without you having to believe in luck. You are taken to an office. It has furniture a clerk files. Rented by the week, in the accounts that survive, but you have no way of knowing that and no reason to ask. You are shown documents, deeds, transfers, correspondence with officials, sometimes a bound ledger of toll receipts showing what the asset earns. The receipts are the persuasive part, because they answer the only question that really matters. What does it pay? You are given time, not too much, and encouraged to think it over, because pressure produces suspicion and patience produces trust. And if you ask how to verify it, you are told exactly where to go, in terms specific enough to sound helpful and inconvenient enough that you will probably not go. A records office across the city opens certain hours, where you will need to know the correct volume and page. Every step is individually normal. What makes it work is that no single step is the moment where a careful person would stop, and by the time you have taken all of them, you have already spent weeks treating the thing as real. That is the actual architecture of a confidence trick, and it has not changed since. The word confidence in it never referred to the criminal's swagger. It referred to what he was asking you for. The police, meanwhile, kept finding people at the bridge. This is the detail that gives the story its comedy and its evidence at once. New York officers repeatedly had to remove buyers who had arrived to take possession, putting up toll barriers, setting up booths, in some accounts beginning to erect barricades across the walkway to start charging. Think about what that behavior means. These were not people who had been talked into a joke. They had paid, they believed they owned a piece of infrastructure, and they turned up with materials to begin operating it. The belief was complete enough to act on. The other reason the buyers acted as they did is that they had nowhere to complain to. A man who has handed over his savings for a deed to the Brooklyn Bridge is in an unusually bad position. Reporting it means admitting in public that he believed it. Many of the marks were recent immigrants with limited English, uncertain immigration status, or a community reputation to protect. Some had borrowed the money from relatives. That silence is not incidental to the fraud, it is part of the design. Every confidence trick of this era selected, deliberately, for victims who would find reporting more painful than losing the money. Lustig chose a scrap dealer anxious about his social standing for exactly that reason, and was proved right when the man said nothing at all. Which means the arrests we know about are a floor, not a count. Parker was caught when a victim was angry enough, or foolish enough, or simply desperate enough to go to the police. There is no way to know how many did not. It also explains the toll booths. A man who has just realized he may have been cheated has one obvious way to find out without admitting anything to anybody. Go to the bridge and start collecting. If it works, he was right. If somebody stops him, he has his answer, and the police report is written by the officer rather than by him. Parker was arrested and convicted 3 times. The third conviction, in December 1928, came under New York's habitual offender provisions, and it carried a life sentence. A life sentence for selling deeds is a striking outcome, and it says something about how the law of the period worked. The individual frauds were not, on their own, enormous crimes. What produced the sentence was the habitual offender provision, the accumulation, the fact that he had been convicted twice before and had simply resumed. He was sentenced for being incorrigible, rather than for the size of any one theft. He was sent to Sing Sing, where by most accounts he was popular, with the other prisoners and with the guards, who apparently enjoyed his stories. He died there in 1936, having served 8 years. Parker was not alone, and the comparison cases are instructive because they show the same structure working on people who were not immigrants and not poor. The most direct parallel is Victor Lustig, who in 1925 sold the Eiffel Tower for scrap. His method was better documented than Parker's, and it is a small masterpiece of understanding institutions. Lustig read a newspaper piece about the tower being expensive to maintain and the city debating what to do with it. He had counterfeit government stationery made. He invited 6 scrap metal dealers to a meeting at a well-known Paris hotel and presented himself as the Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs. The tower, he explained, was to be demolished. The contract would go to one of them. The matter was confidential because the public would object. That last element is the crucial one, and it is the same lever Parker used. Secrecy explains why the deal is available, why it must be quick, and why the buyer must not go and ask anybody about it. It converts the very thing that should alert the mark, "This is irregular," into the reason the opportunity exists. Lustig picked the dealer who seemed most eager to establish himself among the Paris business elite, took a bribe on top of the purchase price, and left for Vienna. The victim was too humiliated to report it, so Lustig went back to Paris a few months later and sold the tower again. He was never convicted for either. He eventually went to prison in the United States for counterfeiting and died at Alcatraz. The pattern is identical to the bridge, a real category of transaction. Governments do dispose of assets, cities do sell scrap, a document that looks correct, an official-seeming setting, and a verification step the buyer is discouraged from taking. There were dozens of lesser variants running in the same decades. Men sold shares in mines that had no ore, land in Florida that was underwater for most of the year, and interests in oil leases drawn on maps produced for the purpose. The Florida land boom of the 1920s ran on parcels sold sight unseen to buyers in northern states, some of which were genuinely swamp, and some of which did not exist as described. And the Gilded Age had produced exactly the conditions to make New York the best market in the world for this. The city's population more than doubled between 1880 and 1910. Millions of arrivals came through Ellis Island with savings and no local knowledge. Enormous fortunes were being made visibly and quickly by people who were not obviously more capable than anybody else, in ways most observers could not explain. When a society is producing new wealth faster than it is producing understanding of how that wealth is made, the number of people willing to believe an unusual explanation goes up sharply. Not because they are credulous, but because the ordinary explanations have stopped predicting what they can see out of the window. Now the wider point, because this is not really a story about one man's cheek. The Brooklyn Bridge sale is the most famous example of a category that dominated American fraud in that period, selling something the buyer could see but could not verify. Land in states the buyer had never visited, shares in mines that did not exist, interests in oil leases on maps drawn for the purpose. The common structure is always the same. There is a real category of asset that genuinely makes people rich. There is no cheap way to check a specific claim within that category, and there is a document which looks like the documents that accompany real transactions. Remove the second condition, and the whole class of fraud collapses. That is what happened over the following decades, and it happened through unglamorous administrative change rather than through anybody getting cleverer. Title recording was standardized and centralized. Title insurance became routine, which meant a professional third party had a financial interest in checking. The telephone made a verifying call trivial. Securities regulation after 1933 created disclosure requirements and a registry for share issues. Public ownership of major infrastructure became the default, so the question, who owns the bridge, acquired an obvious answer for the first time. The Brooklyn Bridge itself is a case in point. It was built by the New York Bridge Company, a private corporation with city investment. The tolls were removed in 1911. Ownership passed fully into public hands, and by the middle of the century, the idea that it might have a private owner had become self-evidently ridiculous, not because people got smarter, but because the world in which it made sense had ended. Which is the useful lesson, and it generalizes well beyond bridges. A confidence trick is not a measure of the victim's intelligence. It is a measure of the gap between what a market makes plausible and what a buyer can practically verify. Widen that gap and frauds appear, regardless of how educated the population is. Close it and they vanish, regardless of how gullible people are supposed to be. And the gap is not fixed. It moves with technology, with regulation, and with which assets are novel enough that nobody has built the checking infrastructure yet. It is worth being precise about how each of those changes close the gap, because they are not obvious and they did not arrive together. Title recording came first and took longest. Land records in the United States were kept county by county, in ledgers, indexed by the names of the parties rather than by the property. To confirm a title, you had to trace the chain of transfers backwards, by hand, hoping nobody had recorded something in the wrong book. That is a job for a specialist, and most buyers did not employ one. Title insurance changed the economics of that. Instead of every buyer performing an expensive search badly, a company performed it once properly and sold a policy against being wrong. The incentive is what matters. The insurer loses money if it fails to check, so checking becomes somebody's business rather than everybody's chore. The telephone reduced verification from a day's journey to a few minutes. That sounds trivial, and it is not. Most fraud depends on a specific amount of friction, enough that the mark does not bother, not so much that they become suspicious about why it is difficult. Cut the cost of asking, and a whole class of deception stops paying. Securities law after 1933 did the same thing for company shares. Before it, an issuer could say almost anything about a mine or a well, and the buyer had no right to underlying information. Disclosure requirements and a central registry meant the claim and the evidence had to be filed in the same place, by the person making the claim, under penalty. And public ownership settled the question the fraud depended on. Once the great bridges, roads, water systems, and parks were held publicly and could not be transferred to a private buyer at all, who owns it stopped being a question with an interesting answer. None of that required the population to become harder to fool. It required institutions to make the truth cheaper to obtain than the lie. Which is why the same shape keeps recurring in categories that feel modern rather than Victorian. Unregistered securities, sold on the basis that the buyer cannot easily check what is behind them. Interests in property developments that do not exist, in countries whose registries are hard to search. Assets whose ownership records are genuinely novel, and where the verification tooling arrived years after the market did. In each case, the pattern is identical to 1883, a real category of asset that genuinely enriches some people, a document that resembles a real one, and a verification step that is expensive or unavailable at the moment the buyer must decide. And the tell is always the same three things together. An explanation for why this opportunity is available to you rather than to somebody better placed, an estate winding up, a private disposal, a confidentiality that happens to exclude the people who could confirm it. A document that establishes the claim rather than evidence that supports it. The distinction matters. A deed asserts ownership. A record in a registry you can search yourself demonstrates it. Fraud lives entirely in the first category because paper is cheap and registries are not. And a verification path that is described helpfully, but is just inconvenient enough that most people will not walk it. Never refused, refusal is alarming. Always made slightly awkward. If those three are present, the age of the asset class is irrelevant. It works the same on a bridge in 1883 and on anything else in any year you like. The technology changes, the gap is the product. There is one more thing about Parker himself that is worth saying, because the sources on him are thinner than the story's fame suggests, and I would rather be straight about that than pretend otherwise. A great deal of what circulates about him comes from newspaper writing of the period and from later popular retellings, and those two categories are not reliable in the same way. The convictions are matters of record. The 1928 sentence under habitual offender provisions is documented. The broad method, forged deeds, rented offices, repeated sales of public structures, is consistent across contemporary accounts. The specifics are shakier. The claim that he sold the bridge twice a week for 30 years is the sort of figure a headline produces rather than a court record. The list of other properties he sold varies between tellings. The detail that guards at Sing Sing enjoyed his company is the kind of thing that gets added to a story about a likable rogue, whether or not anybody wrote it down at the time. I am telling it with those caveats because the argument does not depend on Parker being exactly as advertised. Even if he sold the bridge a dozen times rather than 1,000, the fact that it could be sold at all repeatedly to different people over decades in the largest city in the country is the thing worth understanding. The individual conman is the least interesting part. What is interesting is the condition of the market that made his product saleable, and that condition is documented far better than he is. There is a coda about the phrase itself, because it outlived everybody involved. If you believe that, I have a bridge to sell you entered American speech from these cases, and is still in use nearly a century and a half later. It has become shorthand for extreme credulity, the definitive example of believing something no sensible person would believe, which is, given everything, slightly unfair to the buyers. They were not believing something absurd. They were believing something that was true of most of the roads, ferries, canals, and bridges around them, presented on paper that looked correct, by a man in an office, about a structure that visibly took money from the public every single day. The absurdity is entirely retrospective. It exists because ownership of American infrastructure changed, and because verifying a claim became something anybody could do in a minute, rather than something almost nobody could do at all. George Parker sold the Brooklyn Bridge for 30 years to people who were, in the terms of their own time, making a reasonable investment decision on inadequate information. That is not a story about idiots. It is a story about what happens when an economy produces assets faster than it produces the means of checking who owns them. And it is worth remembering which of those two things is still, reliably, the slower one. New assets arrive because somebody sees an opportunity and moves. Verification arrives because a registry is built, a law is drafted, a professional class forms around checking, and an insurer decides the risk is measurable enough to price. The first can happen in a season. The second takes years, and it only begins in earnest after enough people have lost enough money to make it politically worth doing. That lag is not a flaw anybody has failed to fix. It is structural, and it reopens every time a genuinely new kind of asset appears. Which means the useful question, standing in front of any opportunity, is not whether it sounds too good. Plenty of real fortunes have sounded ridiculous, and the men who bought railway shares in 1850 or bridge charters in 1830 were not wrong. The question is narrower and much more answerable. Can I check this cheaply from a source that has no interest in the answer? If yes, the ordinary risks apply, and you may lose your money in the ordinary way. If no, if the only evidence is a document handed to you by the person who wants your money, then you are standing exactly where those men stood on the Brooklyn side in 1883, holding a deed, looking at a structure that visibly took money from the public every day of the year. They were not fools, they simply had no way to ask.